All right, deadlift. So we're gonna cover the deadlift kind of as like a movement pattern. So the first thing we're gonna cover kind of is like the continuum of how it can become more like hip dominant movement to a knee dominant movement. But what I mean by that is, so on one end of the spectrum we have like the pure straight-legged deadlift. This is usually used more as like a means of training the hamstrings, gaining hamstring mobility, and then at the other end of the spectrum we have a deadlift style where we keep our hips in a very low position, all of our weight shifting behind the bar. So what that'll look like is, so we go through the deadlift. So the straight leg version, you're not going to get a ton of mobility out of it unless you're really flexible. I'm not, but it's going to look basically like that. And then you're just going to go down to the limits of your hamstring mobility, and that's it. Obviously, as you do it more and you get stronger in that position, you get warmed up, yada, 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 you'll get to go down low. If you're trying to like build mobility and have increased hamstring flexibility, that's a great way to do it. The next, probably more popular version of that would be like the Romanian deadlift. And basically all it is it's the same thing, you just have slightly bent knees. This one emphasizes more of a hip hinge. So you're here, you're just gonna have soft knees, you're gonna push your hips back like that to the limits of your mobility, whatever that is. Come back up, come down, come up. The next version, that's where we kind of look at almost like generally how it's traditionally taught in most weight training programs, most strength conditioning programs will teach a deadlift this way, is basically going to go down, same thing, limits to our mobility, but we're going to have a little bit more knee bend, and this is generally where you'll go all the way down to where the plates rest on the floor, and then you'll come up. So this is a little bit more of a hip hinge variation of it. And then lastly, we'll go into the one where we're kind of getting into like a lower hip position. So that one will look like this. So you'd have like the bar resting down and you basically bring your hips down really low like this, and then you'd stand up from there. That variation, you generally need some weight on the bar to do it, because the whole point of it is you're shifting all your weight back behind the bar, and you need the weight on the bar to kind of balance your weight out so you don't just tip over backwards. So with that, the main reasons to do that is, so the low hip version, generally you'll see a lot of people who are in like strongman competitions and that kind of stuff, they'll tend to use that version more. That version also, like, so when you have people that they don't tolerate shear loading very well, so that's basically where your spine is more parallel to the floor and you have a force going perpendicular through the spine. Some people don't tolerate that position very well, so sometimes that lower hip position can help facilitate them to still be able to lift decently heavy, get a good training effect. And the spine generally will tolerate it a little bit better. With that, and then you kind of like the next tier is like your traditional kind of like moderate, hip height position. That's where you're going to see that in most coaching contexts. All right, in terms of kind of how that affects like the training effects. So generally, the more straight-legged you are with your deadlift, the more it's going to train the hamstrings. The hamstrings are out of the hamstring muscles. Most of them are biarticular, as in they cross the pelvis. So that means they can also contribute to hip extension as well as knee flexion. So when you train that straight-legged position and you're just training pure hip extension, you train the hamstrings a little bit more. When you get more to where you're allowing the knee to bend and you're kind of getting into this position, you're shifting the training effect away from the hamstrings and more onto the glutes. In terms of your deadlift depth, you want to go as deep as you can. It still allows you to keep a neutral spine. That's going to be a little bit different for everybody. So for some people who maybe they're new to deadlifting or their hips aren't very flexible yet, they don't have the coordination yet to go down really low, it's okay to elevate the weights up on blocks. So you'd have your plates on here. Instead of lowering the weights all the way down to the floor, you'd only lower them down to say like here, and then they'd be resting on anywhere from 1 to 3 inches worth of, you can set them on plates, blocks, what have you. It just reduces the range of motion a little bit. As you get better at the exercise, generally you can remove those and you can go down to a deeper range of motion. On the flip side of that, you can do like a deficit deadlift, and that's where you would stand on top of a block or bumper plates or something like that. You can elevate it from 1 to 3 inches. And then if you can get down that low, you know, there's nothing wrong with going all the way down for your deadlifts. With that being said, there's 3 main stances of the deadlift that you can adopt. Generally, the one that you want to adopt for the majority of your weight training is going to be the one that allows you to lift the most weight and gives you the greatest range of motion, and is the one you generally feel the most comfortable with. Personally, I feel best with a width where my feet are about hip width apart. That would be the conventional stance. So the conventional stance just looks like this. I go over under just out of habit. If you don't need to do over under, there's nothing wrong with it. It's going to be better to go double overhand, or if you want to learn the hook grip where you wrap your thumb around the bar and wrap your fingers over your thumb. Those are all better than the over under. If you do over under, I would encourage you to switch which hand is the underhand one periodically. But anyways, so the conventional deadlift, all it is you're just going to go down, come up, and then next you have the sumo deadlift, and that's where most people go out pretty wide with it. The main thing is the wider you go, generally the more you have to externally rotate your femur, so your feet are pointed more to the outside. And make sure when you do that, your knees are pointed generally in the same direction as your feet. You don't want your feet be pointing out almost sideways, and then your knees are pointing forward, because then you kind of get into this kind of movement pattern, which is not what you want. So anyways, go out wide, externally rotate the feet, same thing, hinge hips back, drive the hips forward. Some people will kind of make it more of like an up and down motion, where they'll adopt a pretty upright stance and then come down and then come up. I don't really have the hip mobility for it, so I can't demo it very good. But anyways, that's your sumo stance. And then what most people have the most success with in terms of deadlifting is kind of like a half and half. It's like a sumo, but it's normally about shoulder width, maybe a little bit wider. And same thing, hands are going to go in between the legs on this one as well, and then come down and then come up. The main differences in those in terms of like training effect is, so the conventional deadlift pretty much puts most of the force within the sagittal plane. So if you look at like the body, you're pretty much directing all the force, you know, through the front and back plane. So kind of in this direction. You know, the sumo, the pelvis is kind of oriented in a way that your hips are directing a lot of force in this frontal plane, especially, and that's true kind of the wider out you go with it. And then the pseudo sumo is kind of like half and half. So the sumo is actually not a bad exercise because it'll bias more towards the abductors a little bit. So if you want to get better at sumo deadlifts, you know, training the abductor is pretty important. If you just want to train like pure hip extension and really bias towards the glutes more, then you're gonna be better off with normal conventional deadlift. Anyways, that's all I got for that. Let me know if you got any questions, and I'll get back to you.